All right, let's dive into an incredible story. It's a tale of absolute power, a terrible secret, and what might be one of the most high-stakes, dangerous conversations in ancient history. This is basically a masterclass in how you tell a king he's a criminal and somehow manage to live to tell the tale. So think about it. Here's the problem. How do you tell the most powerful man in your entire country that he's a murderer and an adulterer without, getting your head chopped off? That was the exact challenge facing a prophet named Nathan. He had to confront King David, this celebrated warrior king, who had secretly arranged for one of his best soldiers to be killed just so he could steal his wife. A direct accusation, that's a death sentence. So Nathan, he gets clever. He chose a different path. He decided to tell the king a story. Nathan's approach here is just brilliant. He starts telling this simple story, a parable, and the goal is to get around the king's defenses, right? To bypass his ego, his royal armor, and speak directly to the part of him that still thinks of himself as a just and fair ruler. The story he tells seems to have nothing to do with David, but it is engineered perfectly to trap a guilty conscience. So the story kicks off with this classic setup of inequality. You've got one guy who has everything. We're talking huge flocks of sheep and cattle. And on the other side, you have a man who has, well, basically nothing. This massive contrast is the foundation for the entire trap. And listen to the detail here. This is where Nathan is so smart. He doesn't just say the poor man had a lamb. No. He paints this picture of real personal love. This animal wasn't just livestock. It was family. It ate at the table with his kids. It slept in his arms. The text says it was like a daughter to him. This detail is so important. It's designed to create this powerful emotional punch, both for the king listening and for us. And then comes this act of just outrageous injustice. A traveler shows up, and the rich man needs to cook a meal. But instead of taking a lamb from his own massive herd, he spares his own wealth. He goes over and takes the poor man's single beloved lamb and slaughters it for his guest. It's just a cold, greedy, abusive power. As King David is listening to this, he has absolutely no idea that this story is about him. As a ruler who prides himself on his sense of justice, he hears this tale and he is filled with this righteous, white-hot fury. The parable is working perfectly. The king is about to judge the man in the story, and in doing so, he is about to judge himself. David's reaction is instant and it is severe. He doesn't just condemn the guy, he hands down a death sentence. He declares the man must die and pay back 4 times the value of the lamb, all because, as David says, he had no pity. With his own mouth, David has just set the standard by which he's about to be judged. Just picture the scene. The king has just thundered his judgment. The courtroom is probably silent, and the prophet Nathan, he just lets those words hang in the air, a perfect, heavy pause before he springs the trap. And there it is, one of the most dramatic lines in literature, period. Nathan turns that parable into a mirror. The rich man with more sheep than he could count, that's you, David, with all your power and all your wives. And the poor man's single beloved lamb, that was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. You took her, David, just like the rich man took the lamb. Now that the trap is sprung, Nathan lays out the charges with brutal clarity. He accuses David of despising God's own word, of murdering his loyal soldier Uriah, and then stealing his wife. He even twists the knife, pointing out the irony that David used the sword of his enemies, the Ammonites, to do his dirty work. The secret crime is now completely out in the open.
But the confrontation is not over, not by a long shot. The sin has been revealed, and now comes the judgment. This is no longer about David's opinion on a fictional character. This is about the real-world consequences for the king. The bill for his actions is about to come due. And this introduces a huge theme here, public consequence for private sin. See, David thought he did all this in secret, that he'd gotten away with it. But the judgment against him is going to be the complete opposite. It's going to happen in broad daylight for all of Israel to see, a public humiliation to match the private crime. And the price is just devastating. First, a curse of violence on his entire family. The sword will never leave your house. Second, betrayal from the inside. Disaster will come from your own household. Third, public shame. Your wives will be taken from you openly. And finally, the most immediate and heartbreaking consequence of all, the child that was conceived with Bathsheba will die. Now, to David's credit, he doesn't argue, he doesn't make excuses, he doesn't blame anyone else, and he definitely doesn't execute the prophet for his guts.
He is completely broken. His response is simple, it's immediate, and it's total. I have sinned against the Lord. He owns it, completely. And just as Nathan predicted, the consequences start right away. The first part of that judgment begins to unfold. The infant son born to David and Bathsheba gets deathly ill. And this throws David from his position of ultimate power into one of total helplessness. It kicks off this period of intense grief and desperate pleading. For a whole week, the king just abandons everything. He isn't being a king, he's just being a father. He fasts, refuses any food or comfort, and just lies there on the ground, praying and begging God to spare his son's life. It's a raw picture of a father's anguish. But his reaction when the child finally dies is so unexpected. His attendants are terrified to even tell him the news. They're worried he might harm himself in his grief. But the moment David finds out the child is gone, his mourning just stops. He gets up, he washes his face, changes his clothes, he worships, and then he asks for a meal. His servants are just completely baffled by this sudden switch. And his explanation for this is actually incredibly profound. He tells his servants, look, while the child was alive, there was still hope. There was a reason to plead with God. But once he was dead, what's the point of fasting and weeping? I can't bring him back. All that's left is to accept the finality of it, with the hope of being reunited one day. It's this moment of just stunning clarity and acceptance. But even with this crushing personal tragedy, and with this shadow of judgment hanging over his family, life doesn't stop. David is still the king. He's got a war to fight and a country to run. And so the story has to shift from this private room of grief back to the public stage of power and politics. David comforts his wife Bathsheba, and they have another son. They name him Solomon. And the text gives us this critical little detail, a little glimmer of grace in the middle of all this judgment. It says, the Lord loved him. This is a powerful sign of a new beginning, and this child will of course grow up to be David's famous successor. In the meantime, the war with the Ammonites, the very war that was the backdrop for David's original sin, is still raging. His general Joab is right on the verge of capturing the capital city, Rabbah, and he sends a message to the king to come and deliver the final blow. So David rallies the army and steps back into his public role as commander-in-chief. And the campaign is a huge success. David captures the city, he takes the king's incredibly valuable crown for himself, and he seizes a ton of plunder. And what's so fascinating here is the contrast. Despite his profound moral failure, his public power as a conquering king is still very much intact. His reign just keeps going, shadowed by sin, but still effective on the world stage. And that brings us to the final, essential question this whole story raises. It forces us to think about a timeless problem. It suggests that a leader's secret sins have a funny way of becoming public consequences, of rippling out and affecting their family, their nation, everyone. And that leaves us to wonder, can a person's private character ever truly be separated from their public role?